I have a few differences about what the result of stopping Brexit would be, because I don't believe that we are in a situation as apocalyptic as civil war if it were to be stopped. My view is that if Parliament were to stop Brexit, especially a particularly destructive Brexit, the worst thing that could happen is that a large cohort of current MPs would be de-elected, which in itself would be the change that people have been looking for. So surely the most radical thing and the best thing that can be done for the country from that perspective, even for the disgruntled people who voted for it, is to stop Brexit. Admittedly self-destructive for MPs, but it perhaps in the best interests of 100% of the country.
So let me try it. Of those two questions, I think the least complicated is Brexit. So I'll start with that if I can. So I'm not trying to say that you've just said this, but I get a bit irritated by the narrative that's developed in some parts of this debate that MPs are only voting for their own interests. So, you know, as a Member of Parliament, I think I'm very like many of my colleagues, is that we go out and we make an argument. We don't always have the same view as our constituents, and largely I think our constituents are quite accommodating of that. There is a reason why people took to the streets, both in celebration and sadness, when Margaret Thatcher and Tony Benn died, and that is because they knew where they were with those politicians. These are people who wore their values on their sleeve. They engaged in the debate. They articulated to the public what it was that they stood for and why. And I think largely the public still respects politicians who do that. So, I haven't come to the view that it was right to trigger Article 50 because I've suddenly thought, oh God, what's going to happen to me? I've come to that view in part because of the answer that I gave earlier about the way that this has become so much a sort of crux issue about trust in politics and in politicians, and about the need for fundamental change. But I also came to that view because Parliament voted for a referendum on this issue, and you can debate whether that was a good idea or not. I think there are lots of people who would say that we took a very complex issue and asked people to give a yes/no answer, which in itself is polarising. But we did ask the people to decide, and in the end I think that is why you found a lot of MPs who would still vote Remain tomorrow if there was a referendum, who are now determined to make the best of it. You can't delegate a decision to the people and then say, well, actually, we don't like the result, best of three. So now I think the question is, how do you move the country forward? It feels very angry and it feels very divided where I sit in Parliament. Certainly on social media it feels like that, and in the TV studios and in the chamber. But most of the families in my constituency were split down the middle. It was very, very common to find a man voting one way and a woman voting the other. My next door neighbours were exactly that, and they're not, shouting at each other over the dinner table every night. They've moved on. They'd just like to see us resolve this. I know that's complicated. I mean, that is incredibly complicated. It's absorbing all of our time and energy in politics at the moment. But I think it's absolutely essential that we do. What I think is missing in politics now is a sense for the country of what comes next. Even people who voted for really fundamental change and coming out of the European Union, I think, are quite desperate for some sort of hope that life is going to get better and that things are going to be much more stable for them and their families in the future. And that sense of hopefulness, it just feels to me that nobody in British politics at the moment has managed to convince the public, not just that there is a better vision of Britain post-Brexit, but what the path to that will look like, and that there is a plausible path to that. One of the striking things about the 2017 election is that the split between towns and cities. There's a piece of research by the New Economics Foundation that came out last week. It found that the Tories did best in 2017, made the biggest inroads in those areas that had experienced relative economic decline in recent years. Labour did best in those areas that had experienced relative economic growth. what that tells me for my own party is that we are doing very well, I think in large part thanks to Jeremy and to the manifesto, at galvanising those people who already feel that there is hope and optimism and ambition for the future. Where we haven't done well for a very long time is in giving hope to those people who feel that there is none. And that is how Labour wins in the end. This is the only time in our history that we have won, and won convincingly, is when we've offered hope to people who are really struggling that life can be better. So this is the immediate challenge. I mean, it's the challenge for all politicians, but it's particularly the challenge for my party, is how we build a picture of a Britain that can be better as we leave the European Union, and then we offer a plausible path to get there.
Before we come on to the
I'm talking for so long, so I have to avoid this question.
No, we're not going to avoid it. It's a great question. But you were talking there about the referendum, and you implied that some people basically think having a referendum in the first place was a mistake. Is that your view now? Do you look back on it and think, actually, we should have, that was a daft thing to do because the nature of the question is not appropriate for a referendum and we shouldn't have done it?
I had reservations about the way in which the referendum was done. So, firstly, I wrote to several of my constituents when I was first elected who were pushing for an EU referendum and said to them, I think politics is all about priorities. And there are really pressing issues in this country that I would like to see us address. If we vote to leave the European Union, I think that all our time and energy will be absorbed in working out how to do it. I would always have been a Remainer, that's been my view all my life, but that wasn't the reason why I thought that it was potentially very problematic. The reason I thought it was potentially very problematic is because I thought there was a decent chance that we might leave. And at that point, not knowing how we would do it would mean that we didn't talk about the crisis in social care, crisis in mental health, climate change, these really difficult issues that are coming down the line and that are affecting people now. And I think I was right in that. But it's also that the way in which the referendum was done, I think, was very difficult for people. Quite often I had people coming up to me saying, I actually have mixed feelings about this. A lot of people described it as a choice, in my part of the world, described it as a choice between heart and head. That rationally they were more persuaded by the argument that it didn't make sense to come out, but emotionally they felt a real tug from the sort of values that were apparently on offer of, you know, much more dignity, much more control, much more autonomy. And I don't think we should have put people in a position where we were tugging them apart like that, or at least if we were going to put people in that position, I think we should have done a lot more to ensure that there was better information out there before we started, so that people didn't feel suddenly that they would have this huge decision thrust upon them, which they had to go off and research and make to the best of their ability. I just think this was a very difficult thing to ask people to do, and that's why I described it as exciting. It's not because, you know, I wanted to spend ages talking about an EU referendum. It's because what I saw happen during that process is people say, okay, this is really difficult, I'm going to have to think about it. This is so different to the narrative that I see reflected when I'm down here during the week, where people tell me that my constituents didn't think about it, that they didn't understand the question. It's the opposite, actually. They did understand the question. They did think very, very hard about it in a way that I've not seen before. So it's good in the sense that, you know, we suddenly found that politics came to life again. It's bad in the sense that what's happened next is we've completely cut the public out of that conversation. And so now it's gone into these, you know, details being worked out by a small group of bureaucrats and politicians that has been boiled down to something that doesn't have a lot of life for a lot of people, and actually, frankly, in my constituency, seems to miss the point. You know, we're arguing constantly about trade rules, and they're really, you know, they really matter. They'll have huge implications, but all those big value issues that people felt they were voting for about power and autonomy and dignity and control, all of that has been cut out of the conversation, and the public have been cut out of the conversation about what comes next.
Now,